It was the 11th of February 2025 when Lil Digivert received a direct message. As the owner of CityRP, a city roleplay server with its own elected government, Lil Digivert was no stranger to receiving direct messages. He, along with server staff, had to ensure that parliamentary elections were being held, prime ministers were being appointed, and court cases were filtering through its independent judicial system. Like many other political roleplay and civilization servers, CityRP also had a vibrant economy to attend to. Players set up wholesalers, fishmongers and florists, newspapers, law firms and real estate agents, supermarkets, casinos and auction houses with propeller planes, bicycles and guns. With such a complex economy, it was only a matter of time before CityRP had an emerging financial sector filled with accountancy firms, stock markets and retail banks. The person who texted him was Nexlin, the CEO of Vanguard National Bank. A multinational titan that operated on multiple Minecraft servers, Vanguard National Bank reportedly owned 8.2 million CityRP dollars in global assets at the time. As players can trade CityRP dollars for US dollars amongst themselves, sanctioned or otherwise, it meant that the bank was valuing itself at over 33,000 US dollars at real money trading rates. Hi Digi. Hey. A trader called NimQ abused the Vanguard MarketAccess platform and transferred 1 million Democracy Craft dollars to CityRP, which is 100,000 in CityRP dollars. We would like your blessing or backing for us to get it back from NimQ. Yeah, for sure. What can we do? Nexlin had just alleged that the bank was defrauded to the tune of 100,000 CityRP dollars. Vanguard MarketAccess, the platform where the alleged fraud took place, was a website that allowed Vanguard's customers to bet on real-world stocks using virtual money. If the price of a stock went down, the bank won the bet. If the price of a stock went up, the customer won the bet. NimQ, the trader in question, had tried to cash in on his winnings by converting the 1 million Democracy Craft dollars he earned, the currency of an entirely different server, to 100,000 CityRP dollars. And Nexlin wanted his money back pronto. By the time Nexlin sent his urgent plea to Lil Digivert, it felt like everything that could go wrong for the bank was going wrong. Just a month before, it had CityRP officials scrambling to freeze the bank accounts of one of its clients, as it had allowed 5,700 US dollars of illicitly obtained CityRP dollars to be laundered through its currency exchange. 2 months before, the bank's CityRP branch was insolvent, running out of CityRP dollars to pay out the currency traders that were betting against Democracy Craft's currency. News outlets were reporting everything from rude customer service to dishonest banking practices, and queues of customers waiting to withdraw money from the bank had begun to emerge. But if that wasn't enough, regulators across multiple servers had begun opening up probes against the bank, investigating everything from alleged misrepresentations of financial statements to illegal banking operations to suspected tax fraud. NimQ's adventurism couldn't have come at a worse time for the bank. But things were about to get a whole lot worse when a CityRP court, having heard the case between NimQ and Vanguard National Bank, gave a gut punch of ruling. There was no evidence to substantiate suspicions that NimQ committed fraud. Vanguard had failed to explain how an alleged bug was abused. Vanguard must unfreeze NimQ's bank accounts and pay out immediately. When Nexlin went to court, he failed to mention one specific detail. The 100,000 CityRP dollars was just the amount NimQ chose to withdraw. NimQ actually made more than that, and he had the rest of his money in his trading account. More specifically, he still had 85 million CityRP dollars left, or 345,000 US dollars at real money trading rates. NimQ made $200,000 of that in just 3 minutes. NimQ would never get to see that money, because on the 16th of May 2025, the bank ceased operations. Customers across CityRP began reporting difficulties in withdrawing their money from the bank. They weren't the only ones. Similar reports began filtering in from the bank's clients in other servers. Treasury officials in Democracy Craft, as it turned out, had begun initiating bankruptcy proceedings against the bank, alleging that it was completely insolvent. As part of the legal proceedings, a court had issued an emergency court order freezing the bank's operations, and the bank, in turn, chose to freeze its operations globally. The bank owed over $38,000 across 4 separate servers. It owed money to players who had their savings in the bank, companies who had their funds in the bank, financial institutions who had their money in the bank. Vanguard was too big to fail, and it was about to fail. Democracycraft was going to have another financial crisis, and this time, its effects were going global. The origins of Vanguard National Bank can be traced back to January 2023, when Nexlin, a player on the server Democracycraft, bought a banking platform called Gamblers Anonymous, which he later renamed Discover Bank, one of the 2 main branches of VNB. At the time, Democracycraft was in the midst of a full-blown economic recession. In January 2022, the server's stock market collapsed following a news report that the company running it, the Onyx Exchange, had run out of money. $10,000 worth of virtual assets, including company stocks and cryptocurrency, blew up, taking people's savings, business investments, and an entire bank down with it. But the aftershocks of the Onyx Exchange collapse were only really felt 1 year later, when the banking sector began to see a tidal wave of bankruptcies. One major bank after another, bank after bank, began to fall. Players across the server began losing years of their savings they had entrusted to the banks. Businesses struggled to survive as consumer spending plummeted to the ground, falling so much that there were fears of currency deflation. Add in corruption scandals, infighting among regulators, and a harsh program of austerity, and what you're left with is a broken server operating on next to zero trust. Discover Bank wasn't Nexlin's first venture into the financial sector. Under his company, the Belmont Financial Group, later renamed to Vanguard & Co., Nexlin had already gained extensive experience offering a range of financial services, including issuing credit cards, purchasing private debt, and writing research reports. By December 2022, the company's assets had grown to over $1 million Democracycraft dollars, according to a report written by an external law firm. Nexlin had the experience to market Vanguard in a way that would attract the attention of a deeply distrustful public. Unlike its contemporaries, Vanguard would pride itself on looking professional. Its advertising looked professional, its services looked professional, its documents looked professional. Credit markets, securities trading, private banking, intrabank wire transfers, even if many players didn't understand what those words meant, the fact that the bank did gave it a refreshing air of credibility compared to its competitors. But why would players even want to look for private bank, considering that many of them had just collapsed? Surely it'd be safer not to store money with any bank, right? To understand why some players were still so keen to find a bank to deposit with, it's worth stepping back to understand what a Minecraft bank actually is and why players used them. Like many other democracy servers, players and companies in Democracycraft have what is known as an in-game balance. It's essentially a wallet that allows them to store their Democracycraft dollars, the server's in-game currency. Players can instantly transfer their cash to other players using a simple command on the server. A Minecraft bank is a company that has its own in-game balance. Players can deposit money into the bank by transferring cash into the bank's wallet, and the bank on its end keeps a note on a spreadsheet or database. When players want to withdraw their money from a bank, they have to wait for an employee with access to the bank's funds to manually type a command to disperse the requested funds from the bank's wallet back to the players. So why would a player ever want to use a Minecraft bank? After all, it's not like players are being made to haul 27 stacks of diamond blocks across 10,000 blocks of desert to make a cash transaction. If anything, it seems even more of a hassle to wait for a third party, a bank, to manually process a withdrawal request to give a player their own money back. In short, taxes. In Democracycraft, cash in-game balances are subject to a weekly balance tax, a wealth tax for players, and a corporate tax for businesses. These taxes, however, only apply to in-game balances, so if a player or business stores their money in a bank, that money is tax exempt. But what about the banks themselves? Wouldn't they have to pay corporate tax on their in-game balances? Nope. To incentivize the creation of banks in the first place, Democracycraft law gives registered banks a total exemption from corporate tax. Instead of paying corporate tax, banks pay a tax on their monthly reported profits. As outlined in the prequel to this video, the corporate tax exemption would be instrumental in handing out thousands of US dollars worth of tax breaks every single month. And the profit tax collected in lieu of it? Well, we have offshore tax havens for that. By benefiting from the server's tax laws and further incentivizing depositors by offering interest, Vanguard was able to grow even in a deeply distrustful environment. In just 3 months, Vanguard's parent company reported it had quintupled in size. By March 2024, the bank had grown to be the largest on the server, and things only looked like they were going to get better. The central bank, keen on dragging the economy out of a recession, began putting the money printers on overdrive. With interest rates at 0%, reserve rates getting cut, and newly printed money pouring in, Vanguard ballooned to astronomical heights. And for seemingly good reason, because Vanguard gained a stellar reputation for its bedrock stability. While its competitors in the banking sector were collapsing left and right, everyone from financial news outlets to credit rating agencies heaped praise on Nextlin's careful stewardship of the bank. Customers who were there at the time spoke incredibly fondly of the bank's CEO. He was a good dude, a clean-cut guy, a man who had always kept my money safe. Rain or shine, Vanguard was always there as the national bank you could trust. Nextlin had massive ambitions for the bank, and it showed. As a pioneer on the server, Vanguard would go on to radically shape what Minecraft banking would look like. While its competitors were still hiring players to manually edit cells on a Google spreadsheet, Vanguard was using custom-made Discord bots and SQL databases to track the accounts of its depositors. While other banks were simply content with listing their companies on the stock exchange, Vanguard went the other way and instead collaborated with them to create a new type of financial product, Echo Securities, which essentially allowed players to bet on the price of real-life stocks. But Nextlin didn't just want to be a national champion, he wanted to be a global one. By May 2025, Vanguard had introduced another innovation to the financial sector, multinational Minecraft banking. Players using its Quick Pay service were now able to exchange their Democracycraft dollars for currency on entirely different servers, CityRP, Businesscraft, and Harlan. Vanguard had grown from a small bank on the ashes of a ruined economy to a global champion, a key part of the financial plumbing that fueled years of non-stop economic growth on the Democracycraft server. It was responsible for managing over $33,000 of assets on behalf of shareholders, creditors, and depositors. It was responsible for holding the investments of other banks, hedge funds, and the stock exchange. It was responsible for moving vast amounts of money within the economy, helping players pay off their mortgages, subscriptions, and tax bills. By all accounts, Vanguard had become a systemically important financial institution. It had become too big to fail. But that was only one side of the story. By growing at the pace that it did, there was always a concern that Vanguard had grown too big too quickly. Was Vanguard really ready to go from relative obscurity to national market maker? That question would be put to the test in September 2023. September 2023 was not a good month for Vanguard. On the 11th of September 2023, the then Finance Minister, Anti-Lethal, announced that he had revoked Vanguard's tax exemption because it failed to comply with the Treasury's requests for critical information under the Banking Act. Specifically, the Treasury asked for records of all of the bank's customers, including deposits and loans, supposedly so it could work out how much in deposits it had to insure under the Federal Deposit Insurance Program. If suddenly hemorrhaging 40,000 democracy craft dollars in corporate tax every single week wasn't bad enough, 2 weeks later, the bank was embroiled in a second scandal when Starlight News, one of the server's news outlets, reported a story on the bank's customer service. Nexlin reportedly blew up at a customer for simply asking how long it would take to process withdrawal. The client in question, Gallivants, was attempting to withdraw 420,000 democracy craft dollars to fulfill a commercial deal he signed with Afeezi Holdings, a rival company. That, in turn, allegedly led Nexlin to hound Gallivants to hand over a copy of the contract he signed, something that was obviously commercially sensitive, threatening to withhold the withdrawal unless he was given it. This wouldn't be the only time the bank had issues processing withdrawals. 1 year later, the same journalist, working for a different outlet, reported long queues of customers waiting to withdraw their money from the bank. Vanguard's CEO has been a bit inactive lately, and customers are feeling it, he wrote, adding that tons of complaints about slow withdrawals and support tickets were piling up. The bank's CityRP branch would have similar reports 2 months later. Leaked internal communications showed that the bank had an estimated withdrawal backlog of 100,000 CityRP dollars that it struggled to pay back, a situation so bad that then Finance Minister described the bank as being insolvent. These scandals, Vanguard's loss of tax exemption, and its tenuous ability to pay out customer withdrawals were really the first indication that many players had that the bank wasn't as pristine as its first impressions had made it out to be. With regards to Vanguard's tax exemption getting revoked, players were asking Nexlin, why die on this hill? Nexlin had refused to give the financial details of his depositors out of principle, and in return, the Finance Minister took a massive sledgehammer to smash Vanguard's ability to operate in any sustainable manner. With 4 million democracy craft dollars worth of cash in its in-game balance, the bank was just bleeding out money it could have otherwise given out as loans to multiple customers. And Vanguard was literally the only one to do this. Other banks, over a dozen of them, had reportedly complied with the Treasury's request. One player pointed out that the request appeared to be in line with the Banking Act. In fact, Congress had explicitly amended it to give the Treasury this power as part of its slew of post-2022 banking reforms. Another observer argued that Nexlin could have avoided this fight by simply handing over the information and bribing Congress to overturn the law instead. By picking this fight, he and the Finance Minister were hurting the bank's depositors, destabilizing the bank and harming the flow of money in the economy. Vanguard won in the end. After engaging in a long, protracted lawsuit with the Treasury, a federal court judge held that the Finance Minister's decision to immediately strip the bank of its tax exemption instead of discussing it further was unconstitutional. According to Vanguard's lawyers, the bank had lost 465,000 democracy craft dollars over 75 days of litigation, over 10% of the bank's cash reserves, which the government now had to pay back. But even though the bank won in that specific case, the fact that Nexlin was so willing to stake so much of the bank's money on the line to fight with regulators, even as he had so many other options on the table, really highlighted a penchant for the bank to take massive regulatory risks. Nexlin's willingness to throw hands in expensive litigation against regulators, investors, and customers would come back to haunt the bank as the bank increasingly struggled with compliance, the ability to follow the law. With regards to slow customer withdrawals, that's a reputation you definitely don't want to have, because that's basically begging for it to cause a bank run. It's, however, symptomatic of another recurring issue that the bank struggled with: governance, the way the bank was structured in the first place. To use the words of its former IT chief, the bank was only Nexlin. Despite having a myriad of companies, subsidiaries and operations, the bank was pretty much single-handedly run by Nexlin, a fact that Nexlin admitted, saying that he kept the bank to a close group of employees to prevent breaches or fraud. Vanguard was able to operate like this in its early days because it didn't have that many customers to deal with. But as its client list grew larger and larger, and its operations grew ever more complex, the bank increasingly relied on technology. Clients, for instance, were able to transfer money between bank accounts using the bank's Discord bot, circumventing the need to withdraw money entirely. But if a client actually wanted to withdraw their money in cash form, Nexlin was the only one that could do that. And so they had to wait for the CEO to be free to withdraw their money, a CEO that already had a lot of other things on his plate. Structuring the bank this way comes with massive risks, because it puts the fate of the entire bank in one CEO-sized basket, and banks have previously failed because of it. Artrides Bank collapsed in June 2024 after its owner, Anti-Lethal, disappeared from the game. No one else in the bank had permission to disperse withdrawals, and the incident bankrupted one of the largest financial institutions at the time. The DCIB, the Democracy Craft Investment Bank, collapsed in April 2021 after prosecutors alleged that its CEO took nearly 90,000 Democracy Craft dollars worth of deposits and just ran, spending most of it before quitting Democracy Craft for ostensibly personal reasons. To quote the CEO, who went back on the server to testify in their defense, they left the bank's depositors with a broken elytra, some cookies, a ton of books, and that's it. There was always a possibility for Vanguard to go the way of Artrides Bank or the DCIB, and Nexlin always had the opportunity to reform the bank's governance in a way that better divided responsibility between himself and his employees. He just never did. When I interviewed Nexlin about the bank's reputation for slow customer withdrawals in April 2025, he denied that the bank ever had this reputation. Regarding the Gallivant story, he claimed that he had to inquire about his client's dealings with Afisi Holdings because he was doing anti-money laundering checks, which would have been an entirely reasonable explanation had it not been for the fact that the bank was literally embroiled in a massive money laundering scandal while the interview was taking place. On the 21st of March 2025, less than 2 weeks before our interview, Paper News reported that the CEO of Voyager Bank, one of the major banks in Democracy Craft, laundered illicitly obtained funds from CityRP to Democracy Craft using Vanguard's currency exchange. Through different sources, I independently covered the story and found that in 2 weeks in January 2025, nearly 1.4 million CityRP dollars of duped currency, or $5,700 at real money trading rates, were moved by Laudaleo to Democracy Craft, an amount so large it meant that over 75% of Vanguard's CityRP deposits were verifiable proceeds of crime. When the money laundering was finally uncovered, CityRP officials scrambled to contact Nexlin to freeze Laudaleo's bank accounts. By then, it was already too late. Laudaleo had already transferred 1.4 million CityRP dollars into 14 million Democracy Craft dollars, meaning that the money was now legally out of reach of CityRP authorities. If that wasn't bad enough, Laudaleo managed to withdraw some of those funds from the bank's Democracy Craft branch, leading to allegations by CityRP officials that he was attempting to dispose of the money using real money trading markets, an allegation he denied. Nexlin denied having any knowledge of where the money came from, a denial that raised serious questions about the bank's ability to do basic compliance. When I interviewed Laudaleo for his side of the story, he appeared genuinely surprised, telling me that he and Nexlin had agreed to bury the story so it would never see the light of day. But since the story did see the light of day, Laudaleo decided to go all in and escalated the increasingly public feud between him and Nexlin. He accused Nexlin of using his graphic designs without permission or compensation, something that Nexlin denied despite me having literal evidence of him doing that. He accused the bank of committing tax fraud by submitting false financial statements to the Democracy Craft Treasury, allegations which regulators across multiple servers were already looking at as they opened up probes for suspected tax fraud. He accused the bank of intentionally freezing the funds of clients who were attempting to transfer over to Voyager, allegedly under the pretense of doing anti-money laundering checks. By the time Voyager released its AI-generated diss track on Vanguard National Bank, and yes, that did actually happen,
look, Vanguard talking big, but they pockets looking minimal. Front like a giant, but the credit score's pitiful. I see through the smoke, all the lies in the fiction. A bank with no vision, just a dead addiction. They call it a fortress, I call it a cage. Locking up clients in financial malaise. Over promise, under deliver. Same script, different page. While Voyager out here making markets and
Vanguard had become a completely broken bank. Not necessarily because the diss track was any good, but because its lyrics contained elements of truth. Nextlin had always had this obsession with emulating banks of the real world, but with the obscene amount of scandals the bank and Nextlin were getting involved in, the only apt comparisons appeared to be Lehman Brothers and Credit Suisse. But the issue that really earned the bank its monikers weren't even the scandals it was involved in, it was what it was doing with other people's money. The bank had governance issues, the bank had compliance issues, and the final piece of the puzzle, the bank had risk management issues. To make money, banks have to take financial risks because things can go wrong with any investment. Borrowers can default on their loans, real estate prices can drop in value, and company equipment can be lost or destroyed. As a rule of thumb, the greater the risk a bank takes, the greater its potential reward. The problem with Vanguard National Bank was that it was too big to fail, which didn't mean that the bank couldn't fail, but rather that if it did, it would cause catastrophic damage to the server's economy. The reason for this was that the financial sector was deeply interconnected with each other. In February 2025, the server's four largest financial institutions, Vanguard, Vault, Voyager, and the Exchange, stored an estimated 74 million democracy craft dollars with each other. More than a third of that was stored in Vanguard National Bank. If Vanguard ever failed, its customers wouldn't be the only ones to take a hit. Other institutions would likely be affected, meaning that the customers of other banks would also lose their money. Thus, it was critically important that Vanguard, as an SIFI, didn't lose too much money. Unlike SIFIs of the real world, however, Vanguard didn't have an entire department dedicated to risk management. It had one person, its CEO, Nextlin. So the fate of the server's $124,000 economy essentially rested on one person to self-police his investment choices, which was a problem because the bank had a reputation for essentially gambling with other people's money. In late 2023, the bank was involved in synthetic collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, which allowed them to essentially bet on whether ordinary players could pay back their debts, such as mortgages, personal loans, and business loans. In one of these CDOs, its 500,000 democracy craft dollar stake blew up after two people defaulted on their loans. How much were these loans initially worth? $10,000 and $2,500. A year later, the bank plunged itself headfirst into the foreign exchange market, Forex market, introducing a Discord bot that allowed players to transfer unlimited sums of money for currency on other servers, at any time, without any restriction. Sources close to Nextlin made it clear that they thought the bank was not prepared to enter this market, and it showed, because Forex traders rapidly dumped millions of their highly inflated democracy craft dollars for what they saw as safe and stable CityRP dollars. Yet somehow, scoring an own goal and driving the bank's CityRP branch into insolvency wasn't even the worst mistake Nextlin made in the Forex market. That prize goes to his mistake for allowing arbitrage to happen on his own trading platforms. Arbitrage is when you buy something in one place and sell it in another for guaranteed profit. For example, suppose there were two shops. One sells diamonds for $5 each, and another buys diamonds for $7 each. If a player, an arbitrageur, goes to shop A to buy a diamond for $5 and then heads to shop B to sell that diamond for $7, they could make a guaranteed profit of $2. Forex arbitrage works the same way, except instead of diamonds that are being bought and sold, it's currency. If one company is selling one business craft kroner for 3 democracy craft dollars and another company is buying 1 kroner for $5, an arbitrageur could buy the kroner from one company, sell the kroner to another, and make $2 of guaranteed profit. Except in this case, there weren't 2 companies involved in the arbitrage, there was just one, Vanguard National Bank. To understand how that was even possible, we need to delve a bit deeper into how players traded currency with Vanguard in the first place. As a multinational bank, players could set up bank accounts in the 4 servers the bank operated on. If a player deposited CityRP cash with the bank, they could withdraw their CityRP cash at any time. If, however, the player wanted democracy craft dollars instead, they could use the bank's Discord bot, QuickPay. By typing a simple command on the bank's Discord server, a player could transfer their CityRP dollars for democracy craft dollars for a 0.25% commission fee. The exchange rates were fixed by Nextlin, so 10 democracy craft dollars were always worth 1 CityRP dollar. While this was criticised for other reasons, the fixing of exchange rates meant that Vanguard wasn't at risk of traders buying currency from it at a lower price and selling the currency back at a high price when the exchange rates changed. With fixed exchange rates, players also couldn't do arbitrage with just Vanguard alone, because if they tried to sell their democracy craft dollars for foreign currency and then sold that currency back, the bank would always win because of the commission fees. Or that would be the case had Nextlin done the maths properly. As it turned out, if you started off with 10 democracy craft dollars, converted it to CityRP dollars, converted that to business craft kroner, and then converted that back to democracy craft dollars, you're left with $16.02 after commission. To put it another way, by inputting 3 commands on the bank's Discord server, which took less than a minute to do, a player could increase their money entirely risk-free by 60%. It turned out that Vanguard had been running one of the largest privately run giveaways of free money this entire time. Mega Miner M, the arbitrageur that discovered this strategy, disclosed in an interview that his trades with Vanguard netted him 26 million democracy craft dollars, that's $10,600 at real money trading rates. It's worth emphasizing that this wasn't just Nextlin's money, this was money held by the bank's depositors, money that people, businesses, and other banks had entrusted to Nextlin to keep it safe. And keep it safe Nextlin patently didn't do, because Nextlin didn't even know how Mega Miner made his money. In screenshots shared by Mega Miner, Nextlin is seen asking him, "How do you have 26 million? Please respond in due time." When Mega Miner told him how he did it, Nextlin cut the CityRP businesscraft exchange rate accordingly, preventing that strategy from taking place. That clearly didn't stop Mega Miner though, because he soon found another arbitrage strategy, this time involving 4 Discord commands to deliver a guaranteed 34% profit margin, excluding commission fees, a strategy that Vanguard shouldn't have even allowed as a possibility because it involves trading Harlem pounds for democracy craft dollars, a trade that Harlem officials have stressed was illegal under Harlem law. By showing total disregard for governance, risk management, and compliance, the bank that was too big to fail had thrown itself into financial precarity. But if the previous examples showed Vanguard National Bank bleeding out money, Vanguard MarketAccess would be it hemorrhaging a tsunami. Vanguard MarketAccess was a website that allowed the bank's customers to buy and sell echo securities. As understanding what echo securities were is crucial to our story, here's a clip of Past Me explaining what they were. An echo security is a contract that a user can buy from a bank that essentially mirrors or echoes the value of a stock in real life. For example, if you wanted to buy 100 echo securities in Apple stock, the bank would check the price of the stock in real life, let's say it was $200, and then sell those echo securities at that price. In this case, $200 times 100 gives you 20,000 democracy craft dollars. But why would you ever want to buy an Echo security? After all, it doesn't allow you to own part of the company and it doesn't pay any dividends. The catch is that you can sell the Echo security back to the bank at any time for the current market rate. So suppose the price of Apple stock increased to $250. You can sell your 100 Echo securities back to the bank for 25,000 Democracy Craft dollars, making $5,000 of profit in the process. Essentially then, Echo securities allow the financial sector to bet on the price of real-life stocks and assets. If the price of a stock goes up, the purchaser wins. If the price of a stock goes down, the bank wins. The key issue with Echo securities, however, is that the risk taken by the parties is uneven. Suppose you purchase 100,000 Democracy Craft dollars worth of Echo securities. If the underlying company went bust, you can lose at most $100,000. If the underlying company, however, does extremely well, the bank could lose way more than $100,000. In fact, as there's no limit to how well a company can do, the bank's losses, by holding a short position, can theoretically be unlimited. The financial sector has attempted to address these risks in two different ways. Firstly, it has transformed the Fed into a casino. As an institution that can just print more money, it's the only one that could actually afford to pay out theoretically unlimited losses, and by December 2024, it had sold over $7,500 worth of Echo securities. As Technofeed put it, historically, the Fed has had a focus on macro policy, namely inflation and deflation, but these days it seems more fixated on securities and trading. As financial institutions are the only ones that can buy Echo securities from the Fed, several sources have described the Fed's Echo securities program as being nothing more than a cash grab for the sector. When the Fed reported it had made around $4,000 worth of losses in January 2025, the Fed governor explained that it was primarily because they were forced to purchase back their securities at a huge markup. Secondly, financial institutions have traditionally employed human players to oversee Echo securities trading. Vault Bank, for example, employs bankers that can sell Echo securities to its clients. Importantly, because there's a human in the loop, the bank can simply say no if the proposed deal is too risky for the bank. Vanguard's sale of Echo securities differed from its competitors in two key ways. Unlike the Fed, the bank didn't have a money printer and couldn't afford to stomach unlimited losses, and unlike Vault, the bank had no human oversight over the trades it was doing. Instead, it was going to fully rely on a technological solution to allow its clients to trade as many Echo securities, whatever and whenever they wanted, so long as they had sufficient funds in their trading account. When Nextlin unveiled Vanguard MarketAccess to the public for the very first time, some reacted with almost immediate alarm. Super, for example, the CEO of Ephesus Holdings, described how the private equity firm tried to completely de-risk from Vanguard as soon as MarketAccess launched, withdrawing over $5 million Democracy Craft dollars from the bank within the first few weeks of its launch. And if you think about it, it's not hard to see why, because VMA made no commercial sense whatsoever. Vanguard was promising to short whatever real-life stocks or assets its customers touch with virtually no strings attached, exposing itself to potentially unlimited losses for limited gain. But Vanguard's proposition was actually worse than that. Recall how I mentioned in the explainer that Vanguard won if the value of an Echo security went down. That's only true if the purchaser of the Echo security sold it back to Vanguard at a loss. But there was nothing that forced a purchaser to sell their Echo security back at a loss, because there was no expiry date attached to the securities. So, if the price of an Echo security went down, a purchaser could simply wait it out until the price went back to a level where they felt comfortable selling it. Thus, for a purchaser to make a profit, they only needed to be lucky with the stock price once. For Vanguard, they had to be lucky with the stock price all the time. MarketAccess's entire business model quite literally revolved around one assumption: that kids are stupid and make poor investment decisions. That's the only way MarketAccess, as it was launched by Vanguard, could have ever made money. But even if we took that assumption as true, poor investment decisions would also entail risky ones, and all it would take is for one kid to bet their entire real estate empire on something volatile like Melania Cryptocoin for it to be game over for Vanguard. By the time the trader NimQ made his introduction, Vanguard MarketAccess was already doomed to fail, and Nextlin already knew it. All the bank needed was for someone to make it happen. Vanguard MarketAccess allowed clients to buy and sell Echo securities on their website in real time, which meant that if the price of real-life Apple stock went up, let's say $200 to $201, the website would update the price of Apple Echo securities accordingly. NimQ, however, noticed a crucial flaw with how the VMA platform was implemented. When the price of a real-life stock changed, the website didn't immediately update the price of the Echo security. There was a small but noticeable delay. This delay gave users an opportunity. If users could spot that Apple stock went up in the real-life stock market, they could buy lots of Apple Echo securities during the short delay period. When VMA updated its prices, the user could sell it back to the bank for a guaranteed profit. NimQ, like Megaminer, had just spotted an opportunity to do arbitrage. But unlike Megaminer, who did his trades manually, NimQ was going to do what was known as high-frequency trading, HFT. By programming a basic trading bot using Bash, NimQ was able to make thousands of trades in the VMA platform at lightning speed. The algorithm used by the bot was actually quite simple. It continually compared the prices of a real-life stock using Yahoo Finance's API with the prices of an Echo security listed on the VMA. If there was a sizable discrepancy between the prices, the bot would make the relevant trades, increasing the size of every trade as NimQ's account had more money. By the time Vanguard had caught wind of what was going on, NimQ's bot was already executing 5,000 buy and sell orders a day. With $345,000 worth of virtual currency in its trading account, the bank did the only thing it could in the circumstances. It froze NimQ's trading account, wiped it to zero, and refused to pay out. When I interviewed Vanguard's IT chief about NimQ's high-frequency trades, he broadly confirmed NimQ's account of events, appearing to roll back the bank's initial allegations that NimQ committed fraud. But he also insisted that NimQ's trades violated Vanguard MarketAccess's terms of service. Specifically, the bank accused NimQ of violating the Fair Trading and Exploit Prevention Clause, which stated, "Customers are strictly prohibited from engaging in trades designed to exploit system mechanics, including placing trades outside of real-life market hours to gain an unfair advantage. If any trade is determined to be exploitative, Vanguard MarketAccess reserves the right to reverse the trade and undo all associated gains or losses. Customers engaging in exploitative trading practices may have their accounts restricted or suspended at Vanguard's sole discretion." And that was literally it. That was Vanguard's sole defense. The only thing stopping NimQ from bankrupting Vanguard 10 times over was the question of whether NimQ's high-frequency trades were a trade designed to exploit system mechanics. 3 very vague words. In Vanguard's defense, NimQ's trading algorithm did have one massive flaw, which NimQ himself has admitted. The trading bot didn't actually check whether NimQ had a certain Echo security before trying to sell one. If it detected a large enough discrepancy in price between Yahoo Finance and the VMA, it would proceed to make a sell order regardless of whether NimQ had anything to sell. This meant that, in practice, the bot likely would have made a sizable number of invalid sell orders, which the VMA platform would have had to reject. Or the VMA would have rejected those orders had it had basic server-side validation. It turned out that the bank's IT chief, who had developed VMA, didn't bother implementing checks to see whether a player had the stocks they were trying to sell in the first place, because he assumed that everyone using VMA would be a stupid kid, which meant that every time NimQ's bot tried to sell Echo securities he never had, VMA would just give him the money. To make matters worse, the security flaw meant that players were able to withdraw money that they never had from their VMA accounts. As Vanguard had wire transfer agreements with other banks, it meant that players were able to transfer those funds from the VMA to bank accounts held in other institutions, including Vault Bank, Voyager Bank, and the Exchange, where they could then make subsequent cash withdrawals. Nimq claimed that he tried to responsibly disclose this flaw, along with many other security vulnerabilities, to Vanguard National Bank. But according to him, the bank had repeatedly ignored his messages and left the vulnerabilities he raised unpatched. If Nimq had any apprehensions about exploiting VMA security flaws, however, other players certainly didn't. In one particularly infamous example, a player by the name of Naze went on a full-on crime spree the moment he had access to the VMA exploit. Allegedly, in collaboration with an extensive team of players, including bankers, lawyers, and government officials, Naze reportedly laundered 12 million Democracycraft dollars from the VMA to other banks, including Voyager, Vault, and Nexus Bank. Withdrawing these funds as quickly as possible, Naze proceeded to leverage his extensive contacts in Democracycraft's organised crime sector to hide his money from Vanguard and the authorities. He reportedly bought 5 million Democracycraft dollars in real estate, setting up a complex network of trusts to hide his equitable ownership. He reportedly bought a lot of other assets, including pieces of artwork, foreign currency, and company stocks. To top it all off, Naze was more than willing to lend a hand to other players wanting to start their own criminal ventures. Lai Topez, a self-described troll, gave an account of how they collaborated with Naze to plant a story in the Emerald Times, falsely accusing a judge of taking bribes. The Emerald Times was provided with fake screenshots, such as this one, which purportedly showed the judge saying, "That's great, I love money, now I will probably take bribes," while judging on court. Total Juniper victory! Interspersed with these fake screenshots, however, were real screenshots showing Lai Topez transferring 5 million Democracycraft dollars to Juniper's savings account. As it turned out, the transactions were genuine, and Lai Topez had written a script giving every Vanguard account millions of illicitly obtained Democracycraft dollars, a hack that was later partially reversed by the bank's IT chief. By the time Vanguard filed its lawsuit against Naze on the 1st of April 2025, the reputational damage done to the bank was incalculable. Any shred of creditworthiness the bank may have had was obliterated as financial institutions rushed to terminate their wire transfer agreements with Vanguard. The prequels, which detailed many of the bank's deep-rooted problems and scandals, was released just 2 days later. It might as well have been a pre-written obituary. If you were an ordinary player on Democracycraft in April 2025, you'd be forgiven for not knowing that any of this was actually going on. Because when my expose on the bank was released on the 3rd of April 2025, only 2 news outlets even bothered reporting on some of its contents. Many players on Democracycraft received their in-game news on the news channel of the official Discord server, which had a tendency of allowing news articles to get buried by other news articles. So, as quickly as the Rayville Times reported that Vanguard had avoided 800,000 Democracycraft dollars in taxes, the news cycle had already moved on to more pressing matters, like an interview with a cat called Evil Larry, a press release by House Speaker Bezigiza on the Land Reform Bill, a press release by Senator Endeavour raising objections with House Speaker Bezigiza on the Land Reform Bill, an article by Paper News exposing how the banks have been paying next to 0%, a press release by Bezigiza raising objections with Endeavour's objections with the Land Reform Bill, a question by server co-owner Technofeed asking when Evil Larry the cat would be captured, a press release by Endeavour raising objections with Bezigiza's objections with his objections with the Land Reform Bill, a press release by Bezigiza raising objections with Endeavour's objections with his objections of Endeavour's objections with the Land Reform Bill, a press release by Endeavour. Democracycraft's financial news outlets didn't seem to care about the prequel reports either. In the days after they were published, Quark News reported on an entirely different story of a federal court striking down the Fed's ability to set reserve requirements. Business Insider, not the real one, reported that the Bank of Rayville and Vanguard had struck an agreement to start interbank wire transfers, describing the deal as innovative, groundbreaking, and robust. No mention was made of the fact that multiple banks had literally just terminated similar agreements with Vanguard. Royal Eagle News went one step further, not only completely ignoring reports that currency traders were aggressively shorting the highly inflated democracy craft dollar, but instead making claims of bullish investors pouring money back into the server in a wave of growing optimism, all thanks to Vanguard National Bank, the backbone of democracy craft's financial system. While some insight may be gleaned if we revealed who actually ran those news outlets, there was an undercurrent of truth behind Nextlin's self-reporting. Because as the videos circulated throughout the server, it became increasingly apparent that players seemed less interested about the contents of the video and more interested that it was bringing new people in. And not just any ordinary people, people who were actually interested in business, economics, and finance. There were students who were studying those subjects in university. There were banking officials from far-flung Minecraft servers, including Stoneworks, EarthMC, and Diplomatica MC. There were people who worked in the real-world financial sector, including banks, hedge funds, and quant finance. And if you're one of those people watching right now, that means you have money and I want it. Wait, no, that's a terrible way to start a pitch, actually. You can help financially support this channel by signing up as a paid member on YouTube or Patreon, where you can receive a whole host of benefits like exclusive articles, early access, and name features in the end credits. But if you don't work in finance, that's okay, because there are many other reasons to sign up, as listed on screen. And if you don't want to or can't sign up, that's also okay. Subscribing and sharing the video helps a lot as well. As it turned out, some of those who joined were disaster tourists, but others did express interest in joining in a more permanent capacity, and this buoyed investor optimism that there would be a wave of technocrats that would come and save both Vanguard and the entire server's economy. The blasé attitude demonstrated by Democracy Craft's financial news outlets also revealed something telling. Vanguard's problems weren't seen as problems at all. It was business as usual. In the words of Jack, a former Vanguard official and CityRP finance minister, nothing operationally has changed for Vanguard and Nex, at least nothing I've observed for nearly 3 years before it was even called Vanguard. This is business as usual. You've stumbled upon us during a time of usual business, usual, insane, batshit crazy, off-the-wall, nonsensical business. Vanguard will likely get sued for the tax stuff, it'll draw out for months, Nex will pay a small fine, and nothing will change. That was why the reaction by the financial sector was relatively muted. I mentioned previously that Vanguard's problems were an open secret. That meant the entire financial system, from Vanguard shareholders to regulators, already knew about these problems. Nothing I mentioned would have been a massive surprise to them, and the fact that the bank remained standing was a testament to the fact that everyone involved was either doing nothing to stop it, or worse, was actively enabling the bank to continue doing what it was doing. And the financial sector had to rationalise it as business as usual. Perhaps Vanguard's issues were merely a byproduct of how Minecraft banking works. Because if you were to acknowledge that Vanguard had problems, really deep problems, you'd be opening up deeply uncomfortable questions about the health of other financial institutions. For starters, Vanguard wasn't the only one with governance issues. As sources across multiple servers have pointed out, labour shortages of qualified people were a sector-wide issue. To quote one former investor, in Minecraft, companies are tied almost exclusively to the player. Not many companies have a board of directors or a clear form of shareholder governance. That creates a situation where, when the owner or CEO dies, the company dies. Thus, to accuse Vanguard of governance issues, you'd also have to accuse the exchange of governance issues, the server's custodian of over $83,000 worth of company stocks. After all, the exchange was run almost entirely by its CEO, a man with so many other responsibilities he once joked that it took him 7 business days to do what would take 1 hour. To accuse Vanguard of governance issues, you'd have to accuse Vault as well, a bank that managed to hire a senior accountant who, bless his soul, as it wasn't his fault, admitted in a February 2025 interview that he couldn't go through the bank's balance sheet with me because he hadn't been trained to do that yet. Sorry, did I say senior accountant? I meant chief financial officer. To accuse Vanguard of governance issues, you'd have to accuse the Bank of Ravel, a bank whose director, by her own account, had a job more in line with a bank teller than a high-ranking executive, and a CEO who had a job of several banking divisions. A bank who, for all of the fuss it made about being the boring bank that took no financial risk, seemingly made its first foray into it a wire transfer agreement with Vanguard after all of its scandals had come to light. A bank who, despite claiming it had nothing to hide, declined to publish its financial statements, allegedly got the Fed governor muted for an entire week for merely stating the fact that the bank was run by the server staff members, and garnered a reputation for literally hiding the wealth of its clients from corporate and wealth tax. And if we're talking about GRC problems more broadly, what about Voyager? A bank who, right after being founded, had to urgently clarify that while its CEO did indeed launder $5,700, none of it was used to run the bank. A bank who, by its own admission, was perfectly okay to burn through cash to afford the 5.5% a month interest rate it was paying out depositors, insisting that one day its tech division will produce B2B wonder weapons that would bring it bucket loads of money. A bank who, just like Vanguard, suffered the same fate of having its tax exemption revoked because it failed to hand some basic paperwork to regulators on time. And these issues go far beyond the banks. If you were to accuse Vanguard of having serious problems, you'd have to practically accuse the entire stock market of having serious problems as well. Take, for instance, Virtus Group, the serial trademark infringing conglomerate that formerly owned vast swathes of Democracy Craft's media. When I asked the chief financial officer for a copy of their balance sheets, a requirement to remain a listed company on the stock exchange, he told me he couldn't provide it because he had no idea how much the company's real estate was worth. He claimed that he was still waiting for the CEO of the company to hand him that data, but when I asked the CEO about it, he told me to redirect my questions to a user called VD, a user who was the former CEO of Virtus Group and someone who didn't even work there anymore. Or for another example, take a look at Elite Real Estate, a company that made money by buying properties at a lower price and selling them for a higher price. When I asked its CEO how it was valuing its properties on its balance sheet, he told me the valuations were looked over by external and internal price checkers. When I asked who these price checkers were, he told me he couldn't remember because it was a while ago. When I asked a copy for the audit records, he told me he couldn't provide them because the company, quote, literally kept no records. Or what about Uffizi Holdings, the crown jewel of the stock market, a private equity firm who, at its peak, had a notional market cap of 110 million Democracy Craft dollars, a company who violated the exchange's disclosure and reporting requirements every single month from its formation in December 2024 to its delisting in June 2025. A company who had never had its balance sheets audited by an external auditor because, according to its CEO, external auditors didn't even exist on the server. A company who, after gobbling up practically all of its rivals in the private equity space, openly admitted its interest in acquiring what few remaining financial institutions there were because it had no concern about potential antitrust actions from the server's regulators. Perhaps Super was right not to be concerned. After all, the regulators didn't take any action. If you were to see everything I had mentioned as problems, instead of completely normal things to happen in a completely normal economy, you'd have to accuse the entire regulatory state, built from the ground up following the 2022 financial crisis, of total abject failure. The same regulatory state that had zero conflict of interest rules banning bankers from running the very regulators that were meant to oversee them in the first place. You'd be accusing the Department of Justice of failure, a department so weak it can't even prosecute white-collar crimes without getting approval from the Treasury. A department with such a counterproductive relationship with it that it allegedly took them 3 entire months to provide the Treasury a single lawyer to file one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in the server's history. You'd be accusing the Treasury of failure, a department that, by its own admission, never audited a single bank prior to January 2025, a department that, prior to January 2025, never launched an investigation into suspected tax fraud, securities fraud, and anti-competitive practices, a department deemed so comically irrelevant by the private sector that it was practically mocked for having less money than the amount of money bet in a single night of poker by the server's wealthiest players. To accuse Vanguard of failure, you'd have to accuse the Fed of failure, a central bank so seemingly rife with financial impropriety that not a single news outlet thought it was even remotely newsworthy to report the time when the president released a damning 14-page dossier implicating several members of the Fed for borderline corruption in managing the state's sovereign wealth fund. A dossier that alleged in stunning detail how members of the Fed were quote-unquote advising the former president, another member of the Fed, to invest taxpayer funds in companies they held shares in, blatant conflicts of interest that they had never bothered declaring. To accuse Vanguard of serious problems, you'd have to accuse, by necessary implication, the entire financial system of serious problems as well. Because Vanguard wasn't a bad apple. It was a cog in a massive machine that ran the server's economy for over 3 years. To reach the conclusion that Vanguard was a failed bank, you must accept the wholly extraordinary claim that the banks, the regulators, and the government, which included among its ranks some of the most qualified people on the server, of being completely asleep at the wheel as the $124,000 economy hurtled itself off a financial cliff. It's an implication so outrageous at its face that it couldn't be true. The only correct conclusion was that Vanguard had done nothing wrong. This was business as usual. This was simply how Minecraft finance works. Vanguard wouldn't fail. Vanguard couldn't fail. It couldn't be allowed to fail. The economy was working just fine. It was stable and sound. Citizens of Democracycraft, heed our words. Keep calm and carry on. For many players, it seemingly came out of nowhere. On the 16th of May 2025, Treasury officials had announced that they had nationalised Vanguard National Bank. The bank was insolvent, regulators said. It was extremely short on cash, and it had misrepresented financial statements. To protect depositors from further harm, it was seeking to declare Vanguard National Bank bankrupt. Whatever happened now, under Democracycraft law, depositors would receive up to 50,000 Democracycraft dollars, $20 in deposit insurance payments. Anyone know when we can get our money from Vanguard? With the new lawsuit, it will take time. What the fuck? I had my entire 2 companies in there, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. Where can I see the progress of the Vanguard case? Any progress in the Vanguard case? Any word on Vanguard? If so, can someone either DM me or ping me so I can see it? I just saw the money amount from Vanguard and my amounts are not right. I should have upwards of 300,000 Democracycraft dollars in my personal account. Some players had put virtually everything they owned into the bank. Players described losing money for their homes, funds for their businesses, 2 years worth of savings that they had slowly grown. Players across every cross-section of the server described being deeply hurt by the bank's collapse. They didn't know it yet, but they were unwitting members of a server that had a player base divided by 2. On one side of the chasm were the players that knew, players who knew that the bank was unsafe and knew the bank was going to collapse. On the other side were the players that had no idea, players kept in the dark until the very end when it became too late. The chasm of information asymmetry wasn't always this wide. Before the publication of the prequels, many insiders within the financial sector stood on the same side as the ordinary players. Those who foresaw what was coming were the bears, the contrarian investors who were seen as being unusually pessimistic about the server's economy. The bears had put their money where their mouths were by dumping millions of Democracycraft dollars for US dollars and other server currencies, mounting a speculative attack on the server's currency in the process. But the bears never had the financial firepower to fully take down Vanguard. They needed others to join their ranks. Unfortunately for them, many of the players that would have the financial firepower to help them at the time were bound by a form of collective cognitive dissonance. They had the facts right in front of them. They had the expertise to piece together the only reasonable conclusion to come from these facts, and yet they couldn't accept the conclusion. They were in denial. And one of the key contributors of the cognitive dissonance was the fact that no one, at least publicly, appeared to be panicking. When I interviewed Fed Governor Don Trillians in early April 2025, he described how Nexlin showed optimism about how his bank was doing. And indeed, when asked, Nexlin would insist that the bank was doing just fine. In fact, Nexlin was so confident the bank's scandals were a nothing burger, he just proceeded on as if the scandals had never happened. He posted adverts for the bank, he continued his beef with Voyager, he ignored the publication of the exposé entirely, instead posting a press release over a week later about the bank's new privacy policy. Perhaps the best illustration of this distinct lack of panic wasn't Vanguard's reaction, but Voyager's instead, the bank with possibly the most acrimonious relationship with it. When I interviewed its CEO Laudalio on the 9th of April 2025, the bank somehow had half of its assets, 12.5 million Democracy Craft dollars, tied to the bank, 10 million in deposits, and 2.5 million in MarketAccess securities. When I asked the CEO further about the $12.5 million, he rather nonchalantly explained that this wasn't his money, this was his depositors' money, and that Voyager actually made a withdrawal request to Vanguard for the full amount over a month ago. And no, they were still waiting for the money. But as more and more reports began to surface about the bank's troubles, the cognitive dissonance that held the financial sector together began to crack. On the 7th of April 2025, users who tried to withdraw their funds from Vanguard MarketAccess were met with an error message that implied the bank only had 1,100 Democracy Craft dollars left. In an interview given a day later, the bank's IT chief casually explained that the error occurred because the MarketAccess bank account had run out of money, and said he personally wasn't sure why Nexlin wasn't topping up the account with additional cash. The bank's wealthiest clients, as it turned out, had begun pulling out eye-watering amounts of money from the bank, liquidating their entire MarketAccess portfolios in the process. Pugsy, a former shareholder of Vanguard, reportedly took out $2 million. Mr. Fluffy, a Vault investor, reportedly took out $12.7 million. Voyager Bank, as mentioned before, had a pending request for $12.5 million, and Mega Miner M, the arbitrageur, said he pulled out $20 million from the bank. Nexlin may have made no mention of it, but the server's financial sector began putting the pieces together. Vanguard was suffering from a bank run. And the signs only became clearer as reports began surfacing of Nexlin practically begging people for money. On the 9th of April 2025, the exchange's chief operating officer reported that Vanguard had already taken over $1.5 million worth of margin loans from it, and was intensively lobbying the exchange CEO to lend it another $5 million. In late April 2025, multiple users began receiving unsolicited text messages from Nexlin asking them to store their money in the bank. Nexlin's text to one user, for instance, showed how he asked a player how much money they had in cash, and then proceeded to correct them when they said they only had 200,000 Democracy Craft dollars, by pointing out they actually had $1 million because he went and checked. After promising to pay an obscenely high 6.5% interest per month, the user deposited $500,000 of their hard-earned cash. Dimitri, another client of Vanguard's, claimed that Nexlin asked him to deposit all of his company's funds to his bank only. When Dimitri asked Nexlin why he should deposit only with Vanguard and no one else, Nexlin replied he was trying to reinstall confidence in my bank, and again promised high interest payments if he did. Dimitri obliged. The financial sector didn't sit idly during this time. As more and more of its insiders began crossing the chasm, they did the only rational thing they could. They began quietly pulling their money out of Vanguard and began quietly moving their assets abroad. Because for all of the information that was just mentioned, what incentive was there for the broader public to know? if you were a client pulling out of Vanguard, you had no incentive to tell the public. After all, if word got out that there was a bank run in Vanguard, a massive horde of depositors would rush to the bank to withdraw their money, accelerating the pace at which Vanguard would face bankruptcy proceedings. If that happened, the government would step in, freeze all of the bank's assets, and begin distributing them equally among its depositors, entailing severe losses for anyone that had more than 50,000 democracy craft dollars tied to the bank. The only way to jump ahead of the queue was to keep quiet about the whole ordeal and simply hope that Vanguard was able to scrape enough cash to pay you off. Leave it to the suckers to fight for the bank's carcass afterwards. If you were a journalist, you also had no incentive to tell the public. Why? Well, same thing with the regulators. If you worked for one, chances were that you too were trying to pull your money out. No member of the Fed, for example, was going to reveal that they thought the democracy craft dollar, the very currency they were tasked with protecting, was going to collapse, and that the statecraft pounds they were purchasing will be worth $1 gajillion, and that they also had a CityRP stash in CityRP, so there'll never be poor smiley emoji on the record. Correction, most members of the Fed weren't going to do that. Even the incumbent left-wing government, elected on a manifesto promise to move towards a genuinely socialist future, seemingly had no incentive. The president, after all, didn't just spend months of work trying to placate a financial sector that was freaking out over his election victory by immediately pledging to run a centre-left government, appointing a former Vault Bank CEO as finance minister, and promising low taxes, balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility, only for the financial sector to collapse anyway under his watch. And in any case, even if he did, what exactly was he meant to say? Freak the fuck out and panic sell everything right now, it's fucking over? On the 13th of May 2025, Nexlin finally threw in the towel. Having desperately tried everything under the sun to save the bank from its inevitable collapse, he conceded defeat to his long-standing rival, Uffizi Holdings, the owner of Vault Bank. He sold Vanguard's Democracy Craft branch to Uffizi Holdings for $0.00. Super had finally achieved his long-held dream of acquiring Vanguard National Bank. Before the ink on the deal had even dried, the enormity of what they had done began to sink for the Uffizi officials. By acquiring Vanguard's Democracy Craft branch, it had assumed responsibility for Vanguard's 54 million Democracy Craft dollars in deposits, which it now had to pay out on demand. But Vanguard's accounts indicated it only had $31.7 million of cash, giving it the unenviable task of trying to find another $22.3 million to cover the shortfall. Next, I wanted to ask how much in-game cash Vanguard actually holds. This? Like I said in the chat, a lot of that cash is in CityRP or Business Craft. This is how much in-game cash we have. Vanguard's accounts indicated it had $31.7 million Democracy Craft dollars in cash, but according to Nexlin, most of that figure was actually the bank's foreign cash holdings held by its offshore branches that weren't sold to Uffizi Holdings. Nexlin claimed that the total amount of cash held by Vanguard's Democracy Craft branch was actually $2.2 million. There was actually a $51.8 million shortfall, 21,000 US dollars. Uffizi had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. It appeared that if Vanguard was going to go down, Nexlin wanted to go down on his terms, and he was going to take Uffizi Holdings down with him. Whatever Nexlin's motivations may have been, his plan would have never worked. For one, Uffizi officials had several arguments they could use to terminate the acquisition deal. But secondly, Treasury officials would have never allowed the deal to proceed in the first place, and in perhaps the sweetest plea deal of all time, Uffizi Holdings agreed to plead guilty to forming an illegal monopoly. In return, prosecutors would agree to reverse Uffizi's acquisition of Vanguard National Bank. It was as if the deal had never existed in the first place. Following the demerger, a working group composed of cabinet, treasury and banking officials was set up to work out the question that was now on everyone's mind. Was Vanguard National Bank insolvent? Was there any way for the bank to still survive? The working group's name? Classified Cabinet Nexlin is fucked. The working group started from the beginning, examining what the Treasury already knew at this point. On the 21st of March 2025, the Treasury stripped Vanguard National Bank of its tax exemption, alleging that the bank failed to deliver the monthly financial statements it was required to under law. Nexlin claimed that the bank had in fact done so, producing screenshots purportedly showing the bank's regulatory filings. The finance minister countered by saying that the reports Nexlin had submitted to the Treasury were in fact blank with no information. The next day, the Treasury and Nexlin agreed to a deal, whereby Vanguard's tax exemption would be restored on the condition that it voluntarily handed over its accounting records for a tax audit. But when Treasury officials began poring over the numbers, they immediately noticed a massive discrepancy. The bank reported a $13.6 million loss between January and February 2025, $5,500 in a single month. The primary reason for this loss was the apparent drop in the bank's assets, what it owns. In January 2025, the bank reported it had $81.9 million in assets, but by February, it only had $47.6 million, a $34.3 million reduction. Next, your balance sheet indicates assets and liabilities of around $46 million each. Was there $40 million in unrealized losses? Where did the rest of the equity go? No, there was not a $14 million loss. I actually have been wanting someone to help me make my bank like banks in real life are. We're going to create all accounting again. So how do banks in real life do accounting? Let's start with the parent company, Vanguard & Co. Exegex, what real-world bank do you think my bank most closely resembles? Can you explain the January to February discrepancy, please? I must have overstated the assets and liabilities. You overstated assets by $35 million. No. So what happened? I'm doing my own internal audit. The finance minister continued pressing for an answer. How's the internal audit going? Very well, we have a new way to track financials and will transfer all transactions from this month onto the new sheet. Anything come up about the $14 million equity loss? You asked for my deposits with banks and I gave you the most up-to-date information. That's why it seems like there was an equity loss, because we had lower deposits, meaning less cash. The finance minister was not happy with Nexlin's response. Nexlin had just lied straight to his face, falsely claiming that the bank's losses came from increased cash withdrawals by its customers. To understand why this was obviously a lie, let's use a more simple example to illustrate. Imagine there's a bank that has $20 million in cash. $10 million of that is money owned by its customers. If we do the maths, the bank would have $10 million left if we assumed that all of its customers withdrew their money. This is known as shareholder equity, the amount of money the bank would have left if we assumed that the bank paid off everyone it owed money to. Now imagine if $5 million of cash was withdrawn by its customers. That would mean two things. Firstly, the bank would now have $5 million in liabilities, money it owes to other people. Secondly, the bank would now have $15 million in assets, money the bank still owns. If we work out the shareholder equity in this scenario, we still get $10 million. even though a lot of customers withdrew their money from the bank, its shareholder equity still hasn't changed. The bank would still have $10 million left if it lost all of its remaining customers. Now imagine an alternate scenario where the bank reports it had $5 million withdrawn, but it lost $15 million in cash. Your first reaction would presumably be, wait, what? Where did the other $10 million go? Indeed, if we worked out the shareholder equity in this situation, we'd find out that the bank now has $0. It had lost $10 million in equity. If the bank CEO told you that its equity losses were because of customer withdrawals, a reasonable response would be, no, you literally just told me that your bank only had $5 million in customer withdrawals but lost $15 million in cash. Your answer still doesn't explain why $10 million of cash is suddenly missing. This was basically the scenario the finance minister found himself in. He asked why the bank lost $14 million in a single month, and Nexlin couldn't give him a straight answer. Nexlin's first response was to say he overstated the bank's assets by $35 million, but then he chose to change his mind and gave a lie instead. Treasury officials then turned to the bank's income statements for an answer. But instead of answering why the bank lost $14 million, it only opened up even more questions, as it reported that the bank actually made a profit of $728,000 between January and February 2025, which was clearly not true. A closer look at the bank's income statements ended up revealing an entirely different red flag. Nearly all of the bank's reported revenue came from what is known as unrealized gains from trading securities. These securities, according to its balance sheet, made up a lot of the bank's assets. What that meant was that a lot of what the bank owned wasn't necessarily cash, but instead company stocks it held on the stock exchange and eco securities it sold on MarketAccess. The problem with these trading securities is that you can't give them out for customer withdrawals. If someone asks to withdraw 4 million Democracy Craft dollars from the bank, they want it in cash, not Uffizi holding stock. So, if Vanguard were to have a bank run, which it did, and it started to run out of cash, it'd have to start panic selling all of its company stocks to get enough cash, liquidity. When that happens, the price of these stocks would obviously go down, meaning the bank would have even less money. That was the good news. The bad news was that the trading securities on Vanguard's accounts also included the eco securities that it sold on Vanguard MarketAccess. Now, if you think about this carefully, if you sell an item to a player, do you still own it? No. So things that are sold can't be listed as assets. Now, if you sell an eco security to a player, which is a promise you make to pay someone back at a time of their choosing, do you still own that eco security? No. Do you know what it's actually called? It's called a debt, a thing you owe someone. Vanguard had been listing the debts they owed to other people as assets on their balance sheet, meaning that the things they said they owned they didn't even own, and the profits they said they made weren't even profits. And this was a massive problem, because if Vanguard needed cash fast, they could panic sell their company stocks. How on earth were they meant to panic sell their debt? I mean, one way of doing it would be to sell the $30.7 million of debt to a holding company not associated with Vanguard, and then have the holding company declare bankruptcy with no assets whatsoever. But some would argue that that would be fraud. Wait, with so much of the bank's assets turning out to be duds, the only way the bank could survive paying out the over 70 million Democracy Craft dollars it owed to the service creditors and depositors was to have enough cold, hard cash. But not only was the $31.7 million of cash it supposedly had by May 2025 not remotely enough, most of it, as it turned out, wasn't even in Democracy Craft. According to Nexlin, it was in CityRP dollars and Business Craft Kroner, two servers completely out of reach from the Democracy Craft authorities. The working group published its report on the 28th of May 2025, titled Vanguard and Discover Bank Assessment of Health Preceding Federal Seizure. It castigated the bank for its poor asset management and record keeping, describing its actions as unbelievably dangerous for depositors. Nexlin, its CEO, had demonstrated managerial ineptitude, a fundamental misunderstanding of record keeping and basic accounting, and borderline contempt for the bank's auditors. The result was that the bank's Democracy Craft branch was utterly insolvent, totally incapable of paying back its depositors and creditors. It was official. Vanguard was bankrupt. Vanguard's bankruptcy wiped out nearly $33,000 from the Democracy Craft economy. Depositors who had collectively stored $24,000 in Vanguard would only get back $1,700 in federal insurance payments. Creditors, those who lent the bank money, and shareholders, those who invested in the company, were left with absolutely nothing. The impacts of Vanguard's collapse were immediate. Overnight, over 200 depositors on the server lost access to their funds, over 70 of which lost more than what insurance would provide. Players who had stuck with Vanguard until the very end lost their homes, their businesses, years of their savings. Companies on the stock market took massive hits. The multinational accounting company Vandecker lost over a third of its company assets. Blue Steel Industries and Elite Real Estate lost nearly everything. Major financial institutions weren't insulated from the direct consequences. The Fed lost 1.2 million Democracy Craft dollars. Voyager lost $2.5 million. Vault lost $11.4 million. The biggest hit, however, was to the stock exchange, which not only had $3.3 million stored in Vanguard, but had lent it an additional $10 million, leading to a total of $13.3 million worth of losses. As regulators began their fire sale of Vanguard's assets, players began to wonder where the dominoes would fall next, their eyes seemingly trained towards Voyager Bank. In the span of 48 hours, 5 of its largest depositors withdrew from the bank, reportedly taking nearly half of the bank's total deposits with them. In response, Voyager Bank made a request to withdraw their funds from Vault and the exchange. Vault couldn't afford to pay out Voyager. It had already bled out $5 million of cash in less than 3 weeks. Another $4 million to Voyager would drain its cash reserves. As Vault's CEO made it clear in confidential discussions, we're not gonna pay because that would leave our reserves too low. Voyager Bank is fucked. The exchange couldn't afford to pay out Voyager. It had its own bank run to deal with. In the span of a week, $6 million worth of withdrawal requests were made by the exchange's customers. In response, its CEO implemented a 12-day waiting list for withdrawal requests, only lifting it after personally negotiating an agreement with its fleeing clients. With Vault and the exchange unable to pay out to the distressed Voyager, its CEO made an urgent plea to the Fed, the lender of last resort. Hello, we have a problem. All of our money is left in Vault and the exchange, which are unable to process our withdrawal requests. We need to use your ability as the lender of last resort and lend money before other institutions will accept our transactions. Otherwise, we may collapse. Holy shit, the Fed chair responded in a different chat. I think the entire economy will collapse. Bros, this might be it, remarked Vault's CEO. The the exchange will fall too. Officials from the cabinet and the Fed began scrambling for a response. The Lieutenant Governor of the Fed submitted an urgent motion: emergency liquidity support to banks for sector stability and broader economic health. To prevent contagion and ensure financial stability, we propose minting $20 million in new currency to be distributed as short-term liquidity loans to eligible banks. This is not a bailout. It is a targeted, repayable facility with clear criteria and sunset clause. The Fed voted unanimously in favour of the bailout. $20 million was going to be printed. Eligible banks could borrow that money at a generous rate of 1% interest per month. 90 days after the motion was passed, the Fed promised to lock or burn the $20 million it printed to prevent inflation or misuse. Inside the cabinet, officials were debating other plans. The governing Workers' Party, which had just secured their second presidential term, had little appetite to bail out the banks. Unlike her predecessor, who promised to run a centre-left government, the newly elected President Kaiserin gave no such assurances. She was the leader of a socialist party, and she had every intention of governing as one. So, as they mulled over their options, one in particular stood out: the Emergency Powers Bill, a proposed law to nationalise the entire servers banking industry. To quote one senior official, "How will you do a bank run if none of the banks are open?" Before any decision could be made on the bill, however, the eyes of the financial world had turned to the exchange, a stock exchange with a notional market cap of $83,600 US. With multiple companies suffering severe losses, with financial institutions rapidly liquidating their stocks for cash, with a fire sale of Vanguard securities flooding the market, and with a bank run on the exchange itself, there were fears that the stock market could only go in one direction. If the stock market crashed, it would take down the exchange itself, a company responsible for $56 million Democracy Craft dollars worth of deposits and loans. Volt had $6.9 million in the exchange. Voyager had $8.7 million in the exchange, 55% of everything that it owned. And that would just be the beginning. If the stock market crashed, it would take down Uffizi Holdings, the largest company by far to be listed on the stock exchange. Even as far back as January 2025, several investors raised concerns about Uffizi Holdings' $80 million market cap, believing that the company was way too overvalued. When the Fed tried to dump $25.5 million of its Uffizi shares that month at a discounted rate, it realised that no one wanted to buy them. 5 months later, and the company was sitting at a market cap of $114 million. It was scarcely believable that the company could be worth so much. On the 19th of June 2025, the CEO of the exchange made his move. He was taking Uffizi Holdings private, buying out everyone's shares at a price of $34.3 million Democracy Craft dollars. The former Starlight News journalist was now the proud owner of the private equity firm. As it turned out, accounting discrepancies were uncovered with Uffizi Holdings' accounts. If word had gone out about these discrepancies, it could have sparked a panic sale of Uffizi shares. The exchange CEO couldn't take that risk. He'd rather deplete his net worth to prop up Volt and the exchange. So he bought Uffizi Holdings at its maximum price, personally taking the hit for any losses that may have arisen from Uffizi's accounting errors. When I asked him how much Uffizi had overvalued itself, he said he wasn't sure because he hadn't calculated it yet. His estimate was around $10 million Democracy Craft dollars, but he still needed to run through the company's finances. In any case, with ownership of Uffizi Holdings secured, he could now move assets around in peace, cancelling and resolving affiliated transactions between the exchange and Vault Bank. With a wealthy financier bailing out Uffizi Holdings, and with the Fed issuing $20 million in emergency loans, it appeared for a moment that the dominoes stopped falling. The Treasury was no longer on DEFCON 1, said the finance minister. The banks seemed to be stable, and so the government needn't get involved for the time being. On the 22nd of June 2025, the former CDU backbencher of the Azalian Parliament in CityRP announced he had sold the exchange to its new owner, Toad King, who had bought it for $500. After leading it for 18 months, the now chief financial officer of the exchange pledged to ensure a smooth transition to its new owner, transferring the exchange's Discord bot, database, Discord server, and all associated branding assets. "This is not a farewell," he added. "I'm not retiring, I'm just evolving. I'm shifting my focus towards new challenges and greater heights, but I'll still be here in the community. I trust Toad King's leadership and vision. Please join me in welcoming him and supporting this transition. I am confident that the Exchange Incorporated is in capable hands." When the Exchange CFO handed over its balance sheet, something was immediately amiss. Out of the $70.3 million of assets that the Exchange held, $48.9 million, 70%, were loans held for sale at fair value. As it turned out, the former Exchange CEO, prior to selling it to its new owner, had reportedly taken out a $32 million loan. The reason? To fund his overpriced acquisition of Uffizi Holdings. After all, the former Exchange CEO never had that kind of money in the first place, so the only way to get that money would be to borrow it from someone else. Voyager Bank couldn't lend that amount of money, and neither the Fed nor the Treasury would ever fund such a deal. The only institution that would ever lend that much money would be the Exchange, which he controlled. The problem was that the Exchange didn't have that amount of cash either. Its May 2025 balance sheet indicated it had $8.7 million democracy-craft dollars, a far cry from the $32 million he reportedly needed. So he paid the former shareholders of Uffizi not with cash, but instead deposits with the Exchange. Thus, if a former shareholder wanted their money back, they were told not to ask Uffizi's new owner, but instead the Exchange, the same exchange that was still going through a bank run as it struggled to pay out customer withdrawals. But the $32 million loan was the tip of the iceberg. As multiple sources familiar with Uffizi's acquisition would later confirm, $46.2 million of the exchange's loans was given to just one company, Uffizi Holdings. 2/3 of the exchange's assets was riding on the ability of Uffizi Holdings to repay back its debts. When Toad King asked his CFO about this on the day he bought the exchange, he promised to clear about 50 to 75% of those loans immediately. That promise would never be fulfilled. When Stoppers acquired Uffizi Holdings, its balance sheet indicated it had $129 million of assets, $52.5 million of liabilities, and a shareholder equity of $76.7 million. Adjusting for the accounting discrepancies, the value of Uffizi's assets were worth around $56.1 million. The value of its liabilities were worth the same, leaving the company with a grand total of $3.6 million. The company's unaudited balance sheets led it to being overvalued by $73 million, nearly $30,000. But the most tragic part of the story? Stoppers, during his tenure as governor of the Fed, had insisted that he would never let Vanguard fail because he would rather buy the bank at a personal loss than let the people suffer the consequences of its failure. Stoppers never had the opportunity to fulfill that pledge, so when a different opportunity came up where he could seemingly save Uffizi Holdings, Vault, and the stock market by taking the company private at $114 million democracy-craft dollars, he took it. But by financing his acquisition with over $32 million of debt, he changed the equation of Uffizi's balance sheets. The $3.6 million the company was left with was its value before Stoppers' acquisition. Accounting for its newly acquired debt, the company was now worth minus $22.6 million. Stoppers, by acquiring Uffizi Holdings, ended up bankrupting the very company he tried to save. In doing so, he saddled the exchange with debts that it could never pay back. Debts that, if the exchange defaulted, would wipe out 17% of Volt's assets and a crippling 55% of Voyager's. Uffizi Holdings was going to collapse, and it was going to take down the entire financial sector down with it. On the 27th of June 2025, the Treasury stepped in. It was nationalising Voyager Bank and the exchange. 1.5 weeks later, it issued asset seizure orders against Stoppers, Laudaleo and Freeze. They were going to make the bankers pay for what they had done. But by then, it was already too late. All of the executives that the Treasury held personally responsible were utterly broke in Democracy Craft. They were in no position to reimburse the massive losses suffered by the institutions that they had run. And for any assets that they may have had anyway, well, let's just say those court orders aren't really enforceable outside of Democracy Craft's borders. On the 18th of July 2025, the Fed and the Treasury jointly unveiled the 2025 Financial Crisis Mitigation Plan, a bailout in all but name. Government officials announced they were reimbursing half of the deposits held in Vanguard, Voyager, and the exchange. The deposits not covered were the ones held by the Fed and Treasury, which were written off, and the ones held by the banking executives deemed responsible for causing the financial crisis. At an estimated cost of 34 million Democracy Craft dollars, the bailout would primarily be printed for with printed money, gradually released into the economy to prevent full-blown hyperinflation. But the bailout would only be a plaster for the damage done to the server's economy. As of the 18th of July 2025, over 213 million Democracy Craft dollars was wiped out from the server's economy. That's 86,700 US dollars at real money trading rates that certainly no longer exist. Volt, the largest bank remaining, which was spun off from Uffizi Holdings in a desperate attempt to save it, would be one of the largest beneficiaries of the bailout package, set to receive a payout of 8 million Democracy Craft dollars. The wounded bank may, just may, live on to see another day under the stewardship of its CEO Omega Beeble, one of the main reviewers of the joint bailout package. Thritty Stone, the former finance minister, indicated that the cost of the bailout would likely be reduced as inactive players failed to meet the deadline set for claiming back their deposits. As one of the newly appointed members of the Fed, he would be responsible for presiding over a bailout package 170 times the size he proposed in January 2022. Across the pond in CityRP, Jack, the owner of RR Regalis, breathed a sigh of relief. As one of the server's most prolific currency traders, he had aggressively shorted the Democracy Craft dollar, borrowing and dumping millions of it by buying CityRP dollars at dirt cheap rates from Vanguard National Bank. With its economy now in ruin and a currency seemingly teetering on hyperinflation, Jack predicts he would be able to sell those CityRP dollars back to Democracy Craft for a massive profit. As Jack knows all too well, not everyone loses in a financial crisis.